Most recruiters aren't experts at recruiting, they're experts at keyword matching and buzzword matching.
Welcome back to Recruiting Better. I'm Ben Browning, and today we're joined by Jamie Rogers from Darwin, an incredible billing manager, the toughest job in recruitment, right?
And so that's taken me on a journey of becoming way more of a consultant around how does a business hire.
Who's leading the charge in redefining business development in recruitment. Jamie has undergone a significant transformation over the last year, moving from a traditional 360 role to a highly consultative business development approach. But how's he done it?
And that's what I talk about in my outreach. And that's what gets me into more meaningful conversations rather than, I've got a candidate, do you want them? I've got the product, do you want to buy it?
In this episode, Jamie shares insights on what led him to abandon traditional BD strategies.
Hello, and today I am joined by Jamie Rogers from Darwin. So, Jamie, thanks so much for being on the show. It's a real pleasure to have you here.
Thank you very much for having me on.
And as I was saying to you offline, Jamie, I really do think that your story of kind of embracing a different approach to business development is one that so many of my audience kind of approach me about or want to hear about. They all commonly say to me that I'd love to hear more about recruiters who have gone through the process of thinking about the way they approach BD and really gone through that shift. And you're a great example of someone who's kind of been on that journey. I was wondering if, as we get started with this conversation, you could just start me off straight away with, what your experience was and what led you to think about kind of changing the way you approach business development as a recruiter in your business.
Yeah, so we met probably in the height of my frustrations with how new business was going for my team and my personal desk as well. So historically, the way that I had won business was from spec CVs, cold calling, messaging people on LinkedIn, but in a foggy mess of show up and just, whatever's in front of me that day, I'll get through. So I would say there was no process. It was fairly chaotic, but I'm a fairly hard worker, so I got by. And I did okay, and I carved out some really, really great relationships. But my sense of what was going well around me wasn't what I was personally doing. So I was seeing the best consultants had a small number of very, very good customers. And I was competing, but I was doing a lot of deals with a lot of different companies, more so than anyone else in the business at the time. As someone running a team, it's a very sharp lesson when you don't have a process to embed and train others on, because my confidence in the team that I had to deliver new business wasn't where it should be. And this is all happening in the background of a really tough economic year. So software's hit hard, you lose your customers, you realize how difficult it is to replace them, and you start to realize why that is. So I knew in my gut, I have to formalize how we do new business development. And I think I could probably piece some stuff together, but I knew I wasn't going to be able to do it on my own. And that awareness and that frustration was the reason I decided to reach out to you after seeing a lot of the content that you'd posted on LinkedIn. I was just like, yes, this is in the direction that I need to go, but I just couldn't piece it together on my own.
Yeah, I hear you. And do you know what? I speak to so many people who are in a similar kind of situation. I'm sure for a lot of the audience that experience of it, I think you described it as a foggy mess and doing what was kind of in front of you that day when it comes to business development. This is one of the things that I hear over and over again, is that for a lot of people, they have that real ambition. I think you massively underplay it as well when you say you're quite a hard worker. I think we both recognize that you've got a really, really strong work ethic, and that is often in recruitment what we, something that we end up relying on. But yeah, it's been really cool seeing the way that you've gone about thinking about systematizing your approach to BD. And you also mentioned the challenges that have been faced in the market over the last kind of 12 months. Can you just, for the audience, just kind of speak to what your market exactly is?
When I was an individual contributor, I did software recruitment in a region of Germany. And that was primarily a specific kind of software developer, a front-end JavaScript developer. The way that I built that desk was by knowing a small pool of candidates, knowing the best people, speccing them out. And that was typically to VC-backed startups. And so speccing into companies that have got lots of money wins you business. But when money's tight and they're not spending so much on recruiters, or if they stop hiring, that method just stopped working completely because the demand for those skills had just disappeared. So I'm aware there was an economic driver to why business development wasn't going so well, but that was the world that I operated in, and it just crashed.
Yeah, I hear you. And so what was sort of some of the things that you felt, was there anything in particular when we first started talking, or when you were looking at kind of changing your strategy, that you felt specifically needed to change? Were there any elements of that you were particularly focused on shifting?
Yeah, so there was a specific conversation that we had as a management team around how we were going to respond to the dynamics that we found ourselves in. One element of that I was totally in agreement with. We had to pivot our businesses and find the heat in the market. So if we're operating in this niche and there's no demand here anymore, we can't change that, but what we could change is the niche that we operate in. And what I didn't totally agree with was how we would then enter into new niches. And because the message from the business was almost exclusively to lead with spec CVs. And at the time, that felt like a fairly blunt instrument. And so I didn't disagree that it was a wrong tactic to begin with, but it certainly wasn't the foundations that I wanted to build a business and a team upon. And there were no answers inside of our business around a robust alternative route to market. And the things that you talk about, I felt more confidence in, and they resonated a bit with what I read in sales books. And I felt we needed to explore a more diverse route to market.
Yeah, right. When you mentioned those sales books, what kind of stuff have you read, and what sorts of things have impacted your approach?
So I've got a bunch of them behind me. Anything Sandler selling. I really like Justin Michael's stuff. Has to be applied in a measured way to European markets. That's the comment I'd make there. But yeah, like the sales books that everybody knows, David Sandler, Justin Michael, Chris Voss. Every recruiter's read the Chris Voss book. And then I subscribe to all the Benjamin Dennehy ways of cold calling as well. So I'm fairly deep in sales books.
Yeah, indeed. And I know we've talked a lot as well about one of my favourite authors, Anthony Iannarino, whose approach has really impacted the sorts of stuff that I commonly share, and was actually fortunate enough to have him as a guest on the last series of the podcast. Good. Okay, so you've kind of painted that picture of almost the kind of the desire to use what you felt was a kind of a pretty blunt tool in terms of speccing candidates out to break into the new market and using a candidate-led approach. What is sort of the alternative, and what have you seen working since then? You know, what's changed and what have you tried?
So at the time, I knew the alternatives were around talking about problems or paying attention to a trigger event, funding is raised, a new leader joins. But then you have the question of, okay, what do you say? What do you talk about? If you're not going to talk about a candidate, but you need to engage with someone, you can't rock up and say, I'm a specialist. I'm the best. I work in a company that's been around for 25 years. I've got a network, because every recruiter is saying that. When I do sales training now, off the back of the stuff that you've taught me, I do a survey at the beginning and I play word bingo where I've got those reasons on my laptop and I tick them off as we go around the room and people say them. So you can't go to market saying those things. And I didn't know what I would have to say instead. So we meet, we start the coaching program, and the seed that you planted was around hiring becoming a competitive advantage within an organization. I think when we first met, we used the phrase intuitively non-obvious a few times. So there was all these light bulb moments for me, but that specific seed of let's talk about how a company hires and the implications of great hiring on the business really filled my mind with loads of ideas on what can I go and talk about. And then my reading switched to some of the books you can see in the background around how to get great at hiring. And like, it sounds silly to say, but most recruiters aren't experts at recruiting. They're experts at keyword matching and buzzword matching. And so that's taken me on a journey of becoming way more of a consultant around how does a business hire? And that's what I talk about in my outreach. And that's what gets me into more meaningful conversations rather than, I've got a candidate, do you want them? I've got the product, do you want to buy it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I think anyone who's seen your content, lots of people that have seen your content, particularly the video stuff, will also kind of recognize this in your content strategy and the way that you talk to employers and the way you talk to the market about transforming the way they hire and really thinking about what great hiring can do for organizations. And that's been a really interesting kind of part of your journey and evolution, I think, as well. When you mention, there's two questions here. One that comes back to the consulting piece, which I want to go on to and open up a little bit more. But the second one is actually also about books, because you also mentioned the sorts of things that you've read around leadership and around making hiring effective. So again, any book recommendations that the audience can pick up there?
Hiring for Attitude, this is probably going to come up backwards on the camera, but Hiring for Attitude by Mark Murphy, I enjoyed. That's all around assessing attitude and skill sets. And he has some great stats in here around the performance of a typical hiring manager, which I really talk about when I'm talking with my team now, that there is an assumption as a recruiter, especially in your early 20s, that everyone's got their shit together when they're in a leadership role. And you kind of look up to them. And the reality is like 90%, maybe more than 90% of leaders have never been trained on how to hire people. They wing it. And they'll never tell you that they're rubbish at it because it's a deeply personal thing to admit. And if you average 10 hires that a leader makes, and this is across all industries, so there'll be some ebb and flow here, but on average, if a leader hires 10 people, 5 of them, I think, will fail in 18 months. 3 of them will be an average, okay performer. 2 of them will be a top performer. So if you can affect how effective a leader is at hiring people, you can dramatically change that person's life. Because if you're a leader with an all-star Premier League team, your life feels a lot better than if you're a leader of, someone in relegation zone, just a bunch of people that are not top performers. The stress on your life, what you can delegate, how you feel rocking up to work with these people every day is massively impacted. And that book gave me some great stats and great insights on just how important the right people in the right team are. So that's my top recommendation.
I love that. Yeah. And it's such a great kind of narrative and way of talking about the challenge of hiring and the advantage of good hiring. People will recognize, people who've listened to the podcast before will know that I talk a lot about, hiring being a competitive advantage for businesses. But as you say, there's also this individual play there, really speaking to what that means for individual hiring managers around the way they hire. How does that resonate with your market when you take that message out to people? How do you find that lands?
You have to deliver it in the right way. You can't just state the facts like I just stated them, because it's embarrassing to admit. And I feel that personally. So when I got into leadership, I didn't get trained on how to hire people because we're a busy business. We've got loads going on and you kind of learn it on the job. And I hired a bunch of people when we were growing. And I pissed a bunch of company money up the wall. I made bad hires. And how I felt going to work every day is very different to how I feel now that I've invested in making myself better at hiring. So how those lessons resonate with me personally, it invokes, a fire in my belly. So I think maybe I've got an advantage in how I deliver that to the leaders that I talk to, because I can authentically talk about my story of fucking it up, basically. And so, when I talk to people about it, essentially it lands with most people as long as you're mindful of how you talk about that and you don't just, make them feel bad about themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's it's awesome that you can share that experience and reflect on your own experience as a hiring manager and the fact that, the lack of kind of training or development you had around it left you feeling that way. So clearly a really interesting and key pillar of your outreach. You also mentioned sort of being problem oriented in your outreach, or kind of using a problem centric messaging was one of the shifts that you made when you stopped or when you moved away from using candidates as your only outreach tool. What does that mean for you and what does that look like?
When I mentioned earlier, I wasn't sure what to say if I'm not going to talk about candidates. Now I speak often in problems, whether it's an email, a LinkedIn message or a phone call, and I am problem led. and I love it because I know I sound like nobody else.
Uh-huh.
And the reason I say that is because you have to invest in understanding your market, and you have to invest in understanding the problems that your target clients have. And the way that you understand them and the way that you choose to articulate them gives you a truly unique voice. So my sales pitch and my email copy, it can't possibly sound like anybody else. Even if someone else has gone to the same effort to research what these problems are, the way they understand them, the way they articulate them is going to be different to me. So I can show up to a conversation, or I can show up to an inbox, and I can say something that my target clients or my target prospects just haven't heard before. And that in itself is great because they read the email and the problems land. As long as you've done your research right and you've practiced and you've iterated this, and this is not a one and done thing. But when you talk about resonant problems, you grab attention very quickly.
Yeah, absolutely. Tell me if you can. I don't want you to give away your script or your kind of your secret sauce here, but like, what types of problems, or when you come to think about the sorts of problems that you go about solving, like how do you think about that?
And maybe I should explain the first iteration of my problems and how they're different today. And so the first problems that I went out with were very, very general recruitment problems that I think could probably apply to any market. And they were, you're frustrated by the amount of hours that you waste reviewing irrelevant CVs. And you're really annoyed by the fact that everybody looks great on paper, but when you meet them, they're just not up to standard. Or worst of all, you actually do meet great people, but you lose them to competing companies' job offers, and you're back to square one right when you think you're at the finish line. So I thought they weren't bad problems.
They're pretty competitive problems, yeah.
They're an okay place to start. And when I do the sales training now, those are pretty much the three problems. And I say, look, go and talk to people about them, because those on their own, I could call up and that would get me into a conversation. Like if I delivered those problems, they're so general that I had a couple of conversations with like serious companies off the back of just spitting those three problems out. But they are very, very general. And they're also, and the problem with them being general is I want to raise my credibility and I want to stand out as much as possible. So my problems now are problems that I have heard from more than one leader in my vertical. And I'm not going to say exactly what they are because
no, please.
I've worked so hard to get these out of people, and I don't want to give them away, and then everybody sounds like me. But they're really specific. They have a degree of commercial context. So rather than just saying you're frustrated by the time that you waste interviewing CVs, there's a bolt on there, or there's something prior to that that is relevant to a commercial problem that business has or that industry is facing. And the three problems that I just shared, they land really well when someone is in the thick of hiring and it's not going well. But when they're not hiring, I wasn't getting on to a conversation. They were like, yeah, we face that sometimes, but who cares? Well, I'm not actually hiring at the moment. So see ya.
Right. Speak to HR.
Yeah, basically. Or, call me back in 3 months, send me a brochure. It goes nowhere. It wasn't going to a client meeting, just put it that way. The problems now are more resonant regardless of whether someone is hiring now or not. They are felt or they're noticed all year long. And so if you're not hiring now, but I talk to you about those problems, you're much more likely to actually want to have a follow-up meeting with me. So it's really simple. Be problem-led, but it's really difficult, and it takes time and effort to develop and iterate problems that really land in your vertical, but it's absolutely worth doing. And I got a bit lost in this, so I'm just going to share very quickly how I did that. And I just iterated it in every single cold call. At the end of the cold call, I would just ask, can I just ask you one more question? Like, what's the biggest problem in your world at the moment? Or what's giving you pressure? Or what's frustrating you right now? And then I also booked in candidate calls with leaders in my space, call them what you want, reverse headhunt calls, client flips. But I was booking those in so I could get 20 minutes with a leader and drill them on what their problems were, and that would feed my problem menu.
Okay, Jamie. So you've done a really good job there of breaking down the before and after of having problem-centric messaging, and also sharing a little bit about the workflow of how people would achieve that. So I'm really grateful to you for that. But you also mentioned earlier this idea of kind of being more consultative. So is there anything specific that you've done that has helped you? Where does that fit in with your overarching kind of approach to the way that you sell these days?
The way that I have my discovery conversations is very different. So previously, my first conversation with a client would be around what you're hiring for, what you're paying, and what can you pay me? And a little bit around how am I going to sell this job to the right people. And now I have a much deeper discovery conversation where we try and unpack the problems and the challenges that they're facing. And then in that conversation, I'm sharing ideas around how we might have helped other companies with similar problems, or how we might help their business with those problems. And sometimes I've got a conversation next week, for example, with a company that I'm not going to work this job. The salary's too low. They're a startup. They're not going to be able to pay the fees, but I'm going to go into that with like a DIY kit on how they might solve this on their own. And I think that's where we'll land. They might go and fix that problem with our consultative advice, or they might come back to us having tried it, willing to pay a bit more money. But the long-term players, they'll see us as a consultant because of that kind of conversation. And when they can afford us, or when the pain grows, we'll more likely win more work more exclusively.
Amazing. That sounds like a great conversation to be having. And it kind of sounds a little bit counterintuitive for most recruiters. It's like, well, wait a minute. If the salary isn't there, if they can't pay your fees, why would you spend the time on them? But as you say, there's that long game of what that opportunity can turn into. And it sounds as though those discovery meetings where you're talking to your clients or target clients about what they're trying to achieve as organizations is really helping you unfold that and maybe deliver a different kind of solution. Have I read that right?
Yeah. So I've got a good recent example. A business we met expected us to join the meeting and pitch for a bunch of jobs. It was a good piece of work for us, 30 jobs across Europe, exactly in the verticals that we operate in. And we showed up, we didn't pitch, we asked questions, we uncovered personal frustrations and problems, and we used Todd Capone's transparent pricing on a screen share to work out what the terms and conditions would be. And we won that pitch. I think, and I'll find out when we go for dinner next week and ask him, but I'm quite certain that it's because we showed up as a consultant and we didn't just get into the trap of talking about our track record and all those pitch-ins. So the tone of those discovery conversations, the tone of the conversations that we have with businesses now is very, very different.
Yeah, right. Take me through Todd Capone's transparent pricing and negotiation and how you use that. That sounds interesting.
I'm pretty sure it is Todd Capone that
I think it is.
But yeah. So when he was on your podcast, he talked about a big negotiation he had with a very big business, and they were hard-nosed negotiators, and he didn't play into that. He just got a pen, went to a whiteboard, drew out, these are the things that matter to me. This is what I want. And tell me, what do you want? And they just hashed it out on a whiteboard, and they ended up with a good deal. And I think the factors that were in his negotiation were very transferable to recruitment. It was how much you're going to pay, how often you're going to buy, how quickly you're going to pay your invoices, and how forecastable is this commercial relationship going to be. So in the conversation that I had with this business, we did a screen share, and on the left-hand side, I had value, how much is paid, timing of cash, how fast invoices are paid, predictability and forecast, the volume of vacancies to hire for, and quality of relationship, collaboration, communication, commitment. Right next to those, I've got a column that literally says, we want. and it's 30% fees against the salary and a guaranteed bonus. The timing of cash is 14-day payment terms, and that we raise that invoice on contract signature. The predictability and forecast is that we make 5 or more hires with you within the next 12 months, and those are hires inside of our core areas of strength. And the quality of relationship is that we get hiring manager contact, weekly or bi-weekly calls with talent, 2-day feedback with context on the CVs, and exclusive jobs to work on. That's my dream client.
Yeah, that sounds pretty good. Yeah.
And then they came back and said, okay, we're not quite so happy about 30% fees. And we had a conversation around what that might look like. There was a few other things that we had to move, like the payment terms on the invoices to 45 days. But we could visually see, what do we both want out of this? And then the final, so I'm putting that into this spreadsheet as we go. And then the final column is, so it's we want, you want, we agree. We just work it out together on the call. And then we just ask, okay, is there any reason that these commercials are going to be a deal breaker or stop you working with us? The answer was absolutely not. It felt great. It felt like a consultative collaboration. It didn't feel like the hard-nosed terms negotiation or the, we want to work at 30%. Well, we want to work at 20%. Oh, we'll meet in the middle at 25%. It was a mature consultative conversation.
Yeah. I hear that entirely. Do you know what? When you watch, if you see Todd Caponi's LinkedIn content and the videos he shares, and I recommend that everybody follows him. His 2 books, Transparency Sale and The Transparent Sales Leader, taught me so much about how to approach selling from a real buyer-centric perspective. But he uses this framework of transparent negotiations. One of the things he says is, we talked earlier about everybody's read Chris Voss, Never Split the Difference. And Todd says, why would you learn how to negotiate a deal from an FBI hostage negotiator, right? How is that the right way, the right footing to set up your relationship with a client? The first thing that you're going to agree on, you're going to agree to it as though they're a terrorist. And it's quite an interesting, the framework that you've just shared as a comparator to Never Split the Difference is a really fascinating thought process for sure.
I've got that book behind me. And I was just going to say, like, I read that book and I went for it. And the principle from that book is essentially just ask loads of questions. It never quite felt like a hostage negotiation, but you feel the tension in those conversations and you feel the frustration from the person you're negotiating with sometimes. The transparent pricing was a very nice conversation. And at the end of it, we knew exactly where we stood. We both felt good about it. Mm-hmm. It was great for the client and it was great for us.
Yeah, I think that is the other thing that kind of bleeds into this, which is this idea that, and this also comes back to what you said earlier about having a problem-centric approach, which is your clients want what you want, which is for the way they hire to be as stress-free, pain-free, effective and successful as possible. And when you make that happen for them, that leads to you making more placements, and it makes those placements, enables you to make those placements more easily. It means that the client's experience is great. It also naturally has a positive impact on the candidate experience. It's very difficult to do good recruitment that's good for you, good for the client, and it not be good for the candidate. And so, yeah, I think there is an element where we kind of think about business development or sales as being confrontational, but often it's about being the thing of being consultative is how do we get to be on the same side of the table as the client, working with them rather than the table between us and butting heads.
Yeah. But also that's so much easier to do when you enter the conversation around problems that resonate with you and your angle is how are we going to make the way you hire better. They're much more willing to have these types of conversations than when you rock up and say, got a candidate here, 25% and he's yours.
Yeah, totally. Okay, so look, I really appreciate you taking us through all of this. So it sounds as though, if I'm just to summarize back on what we've done, what we've talked about so far in this interview, your kind of the starting point from business development was in a market that kind of had fallen away. You were looking to break into something new or needed to break into something new, and that was the right thing for the business. And in order to do that, the kind of classic approach of speccing candidates or showcasing candidates was the one that the business wanted to lean on. But you were confident there was another approach or a different kind of approach that could have some results for you. And in seeking that approach, you read some books which we've talked about. You applied a problem-centric mindset, which is all about, as you described, kind of understanding what's going on in your clients' worlds and why hiring right is important to them. You've taken it away from that time-bound thing of them needing to have a vacancy, and you've applied this consultative approach to discovery that's enabled you to go into closing meetings and negotiations with real transparency. I've got to tell you, when I compare that to what I see across the industry and most people doing in terms of the way they approach selling, it's not the norm in our industry. So I'm interested to know how that's landed with the team, what results you've been able to kind of get from that approach so far, and what you sort of think is sort of the future direction of where you go from where you are today, and how you feel about kind of taking this all forwards.
Yeah. I'm very lucky. I've got people in my team today that are naturally curious and want to do well for themselves. So when I come to them and I say, to one of my guys, Alfie, I want you to start to develop a £10 million commercial problem. I want you to start to understand the problem menu for your market. He doesn't sit there, slap his head, or maybe he does when I walk away, but I don't think he sits there, head in his hands thinking, oh, for God's sake, they want to go and apply this stuff. So when I talk to my team about it and we're training on these things, they want to make the effort to understand it. And when often we finish conversations, I had 2 guys join. They've been with me for 2 weeks now. And we just did a very brief walk through the problem menu and how we use that in cold calls, how we use that to take a conversation from a transactional candidate to a bigger conversation about problems. And at the end, Reese just sat there and was like, I feel so stupid. Like, you're taking me through this stuff and I feel really stupid for not knowing it already. So it's received well because it makes sense. And even talking through the theory of it is quite liberating. It's like, okay, yeah, there is another way to do things that I feel really confident in. I've not even tried it yet because it all makes sense.
And I've got to come back to something you said earlier. It was your phrase, that kind of intuitive, non-obvious, right? And it's one that I've continued to use, one that makes a lot of sense for me, one that is in itself intuitive but non-obvious. That idea that you can hear something for the first time and think, oh, it makes so much sense. Why have I never thought about this before? Selling
so
in
many
that
nuggets
way.
like that.
Yeah, go on. So many nuggets.
From the time that we spent, there were just loads of nuggets like that of like, oh, why have I not thought about this? And it's so funny seeing that passed on from you to me to then team that I work with. So the transparent pricing, that's with a guy that I worked with. We got off the call and we were like, oh, we feel good about this. And he said, like, I love that. I don't know why I've never thought about doing that. It was so much better. And I was like, that's a intuitively non-obvious thing, Rich.
Brilliant. Fantastic. Well, I'm glad it's going so well for you. And I know that there are still challenges in the market and that it's been a really difficult time for a lot of recruiters. But what's really inspirational is the way that you've sought out a different approach. You've really thought about how to do things differently, strategically. And let me come back to the final point of that previous question. What's kind of next on your horizon in terms of developing the way you work, and what do you think is possible, or what are you moving towards right now?
The thing I'm excited by is more of the wins like we've recently had. So we've just won 30 jobs. A bunch of them are going to be exclusive. They're banging on vertical. They're good fees. That is going to change that consultant's year. That's going to change his desk. And we talk about you need 4 of those in a year, and that's how you build 3, 4, 5, 600K. And now I see a really clear path to that. We've had a couple of wins where that's starting to enter our business. The thing that excites me is running a business where every consultant has a big chunk of work in their vertical that's really highly committed, no tire kickers, no window shoppers. Then the problem becomes, are we good enough to deliver a world-class service that turns this into the best case study the company's ever had? and wins us the next customer. I'm thinking more in hiring projects, which is exciting, and less about jobs. Have we got enough jobs? Is that client a tire kicker? Do we need to take them off the board? Feels very different, feels very exciting. The scale of what we can achieve with those kinds of customers is another level to the contingent work that we were doing. I'm not dead against contingent. I'm a contingent recruiter until recently, my whole career. But this feels far more exciting. That's what I'm looking forward to.
Amazing. And I've got absolutely no doubt that you're going to continue to smash it. So brilliant. Well, look, thank you, Jamie, so much for sharing what you have with us today. Just thinking of the audience, is there anything that you think, there's any kind of message or anything that we haven't covered, or anything you'd like to leave the audience with that you think, you know what, if you'd been listening to a podcast 12 months ago, this is the one message you'd have most valued hearing?
I guess the two things. One, the first thing is the most impactful, but it's the cloudiest, the one that takes the longest, and that's changing your thinking around how you approach business development. You have to change your thinking from I'm here to fill jobs to I'm here to make an impact and improve the way this company hires. But that doesn't get you any results immediately. There's a lot of work that goes on, but that thinking must change before you can do anything else. So the second thing, which is more of a tactical thing, is if I had been problem-led 8-10 years ago when I first got into recruitment, I would be living in a bigger house today. I'd be driving a faster car today. My life would be materially different. That one tactical adjustment of being problem-led will transform the conversations that you have and how you get into conversations with the people that you're struggling to get into conversations with at the moment.
I can't help but agree with that. It's a really powerful message, and it's one that I've loved seeing you really embrace. So good work, and as I say, thank you so much for coming on the show and sharing your experiences. I know the audience are going to take so much from this. So much of what you say is so relatable around the challenges and the difficulties and the kind of the origin story for your trajectory. And I think it's also really relevant that, you're kind of 12-18 months on from that initial point. So it's, you've achieved so much kind of in a relatively short period of time in this phase of your career. So super excited to see what comes next for you. Maybe in 12 months we'll be recording again and talking about what's happened in the next phase of your journey.
I hope so. I hope it's an amazing next 12 months for us. I'm sure it will be.
Nice one. Well, Jamie Rogers, thank you so much for being on the show.
Thanks for having me. Thank you very much.